Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
The dark velvet night shrouded the city in its impenetrable blanket. The full red-orange moon shone brightly through the large panoramic window. The entire sky was studded with dazzlingly peaceful stars. Maria looked mesmerized at the hotel window, unable to tear herself away from this delightful sight, but inexorably, and the clock showed already the 12th hour, and she glimpsed at the luminous dial met up, rose to her feet from the floor, picked up a small evening dress recently thrown out of herself. Gracefully, she dressed herself, and when it was time to zip her up, she turned around to the still bedraggled young lad. "Please help reach." She smiled with just the edge of her lips. The tall guy jerked up sharply, found himself next to Maria in a flash and carefully, touching in one motion, caught in a little secret zipper. He told her admiringly, "You are such a gorgeous woman. Tell me when we see you again, will you leave your phone number?" Maria, ignoring the question, went to the mirror and started to correct her makeup. The young man didn't stop. "We'll see each other again." "Yes, we will. You know, I think I'm in love." The woman laughed out loud. "My boy, I'm old enough to be your mother." "What love? What are you talking about? You look no older than 30. The boy answered her passionately. Maria laughed even harder, and it took her a few minutes to stop her unrestrained laughter. "Jesus, what kind of child are you? 30 years old, that's a lot, in your opinion?" "I'm 49. The guy blurted out in bewilderment. He was thinking that this gorgeous woman was just kidding. But what 49 years old? She was slender and shapely with her velvet, clear soft skin. And her firm body said that its owner was no more than 35. The young man was only 24 years old. He came to the city for a short time to visit a friend on the first day of his arrival. They went to an expensive bar where they met Maria. When the woman offered to go with her to the hotel, he was completely delighted, especially since she paid for it herself. He thought he was just having a good time with a beautiful stranger. He didn't expect to like this gorgeous woman so much. And now she says she's almost 50 years old. Absurd. He laughed back. "Come on, but dictate my number." The kid picked up his pants from the floor and pulled out his cell phone, intending to write down the numbers. "How about we spend the whole night here together? You're in such a hurry to see your husband." The woman replied in a very calm tone. "I won't leave the number, and I won't see you again. Good luck with everything." Grabbing her purse, she left the room in the lobby. She hurriedly hailed a cab. She sat in the passenger seat of the car and kept looking at her watch. She didn't want her husband to ask her any questions. There were messages on her phone every now and then. She was a writer, a fiction writer. Her literary agent was bombarding her with a lot of technical questions. Something to do with layout edits, typesetting backlogs. But the woman only carelessly brushed off the incoming alerts. "Not now, I'm resting. I have time. It's 0 o'clock soon," she thought angrily. Finally, the cab stopped and Maria walked down the paved driveway towards her home. Maria and her husband Kevin had been living soul to soul for 30+ years. To think about it, when they met, they were both green freshman students themselves. Ah, what happy years were those. Maria had been reminiscing about them a lot lately. They had been utterly destitute then, but very, very happy. All those cheerful student pies, joint sit-downs, sleepless nights of sessions, trips to some over-the-top hotels. The most expensive hotel now could not give even 1,000th of the pleasure they had experienced as young people. Spending a terrific weekend by the fire in Latha rooms with no amenities, youth passes. But on the whole, their lives had turned out very, very well. I should say that Maria had long ago thrown her biology degree away. And for many years, she wrote a very successful fantasy, mass literature, of course, but it had a huge circulation and brought a solid income. It allowed not to depend on her husband to travel the world. And in general, it was great. Maria had a lot of fans all over the world. There were even fan clubs in social networks. Of course, not many people knew her by her real name. And she didn't like to appear in the press. When the growing fame has become quite a hindrance to personal life to her husband, by the way, also a very successful man, a scientist of international renown was offered a job at a university in Toronto. And now for several years they live on 2 houses in Russia and in Canada. The couple already had 2 adult children, 2 daughters who had long lived their lives separately from their parents. Both of them often visited their parents. Maria and Kevin lived in a very cozy suburb, very close to the university. The kind of professor's town where everyone knows each other. Everything is quiet, nice, cozy, and safe. Maria liked it here. She was more than satisfied with such a quiet and measured life. Now it was early fall and red golden, famous Canadian clones blazed and Serbian foliage, bringing unprecedented peace and look and soul. Much better than waking up at night from the roar of cars and suffocating from exhaust fumes in the center of the metropolis. And the sky was just beautiful. The light pollution from 1,000 bright city lights and new billboards had never even been seen here. Maria walked through the gate of her and her husband's house and went straight to the dining room. It was where the couple usually met in the evenings. She opened the front door quietly. "Kevin, I'm home," the woman shouted. She fell silent, listening to the silence. It seems that the writer's husband had not yet come home himself. Why was I in such a hurry? Mentally, she scolded herself. Maria went to the second floor, took a shower, washed off the already annoying bright makeup. As she applied night cream to her face, she heard sounds from downstairs. "There's Kevin," the woman thought, and hurried up to meet him. "Darling, you're home." Kevin greeted his wife with joy in his voice. "How was your walk?" "Oh, I forgot the name of your new friend, Wendy." The woman smiled dazzlingly. It had been a few days since she had thought about the fact that it had been quite a while since she had had fun, so to speak, not only for the soul but also for the body. She immediately came up with a plan of action to go to one of her favorite bars, and already there to find a young guy for one night. Kevin, the woman, carefully said that she was going for a walk with her new friend Wendy. The man had no problem letting his beloved go. He himself didn't sit idle either. Just got back from some conference this evening. "How did you spend the evening?" Maria asked. "Great." "Yes, just fine," Kevin replied, and approached his wife to kiss her. Maria sharply moved away from her husband. He smelled a mile away from her, smelling of pungent and very sweet feminine perfume. It was the smell of cotton candy mixed with vanilla or caramel. She felt slightly nauseous from the sugary flavor of that perfume. How are we alike? The woman thought to herself. She knew very well that, as a rule, such sweet perfume is used by very young girls. Without pleasure, Lola smacked her husband on the cheek and looked at him carefully. Well, of course, there's a trace of bright pink lipstick on his neck. The woman went wild. "Kevin, how hard is it to wash off those ugly marks? You. How reckless is that?" Maria was well aware that her husband was a man of love. Simply put, a total womanizer. She was aware that Kevin had a dozen or more mistresses and changed them from time to time. She also knew that her husband was aware of her own adventures, but Maria was on a slightly different path. She went out hunting quite rarely, picked up young and good-looking guys, usually not local, and spent her free evenings with them. However, unlike her husband, the woman cut off all contact with them. Wouldn't even give her name. She introduced herself to others. Maria loved her husband and knew perfectly well that he loved her even more in return. True, this love was a little unusual, and it manifested itself unconventionally too. Maria tried to do everything so that her husband did not see any traces of her cheating. She thought it was a low, mean thing to do, although the spouses knew perfectly well that her fidelity in their marriage is not even a smell. She tried not to upset her husband, other people's odors, unexpected texts from lovers, and other attributes of infidelity. In return, the woman expected the same attitude to herself. She knew perfectly well that Kevin had no conference call today. But what conference at 11 p.m. on a Friday? But she didn't want to think about where and with whom her husband was spending his evening. Stealth and careful lies were her main tools. Kevin was taken aback. "Maria, what are you starting? Should I ask you for Wendy's number? And they'll find out that your Wendy is 6 feet tall and muscular. Let's not ruin the evening." He tried to pull his wife into his arms, but she took a couple steps back from the cloying smell of someone else's cheap perfume. You can show me a little respect. Why don't I want to rub it in your face with my adventures in the hotel that there was no soul? Why can't you at least pretend to be decent? And perfume. Ah, I hope she's at least over 21. Kevin laughed warmly and raised his hands conciliatorily. All right, all right. Now I'll take a quick shower, and you and I will have a glass of wine. But that's better. Maria lifted her chin and smogged all that lipstick out of herself. It's not even funny. Maria was sitting on the veranda of a small university cafe in the early morning. She sat tucked into her laptop, and a large glass of black coffee was leisurely being pulled up. Waiting, stared at the blank spreadsheet open in her computer and nervously drummed her fingers on the table. The obliging waiter stealthily approached the customer. Would you like something else? Mom? Mom? No. She glanced at the waiter. It was a short, red-haired young man, his face, and his whole body seemed to be studded with lugs for spring. She continued to stare at him without taking her eyes off him. The young man was embarrassed by such attention from a beautiful woman, but the writer's thoughts were occupied with something else entirely. Maybe the main character will be such a redhead. Maybe he works as a waiter, thought to herself the woman. Lately she had no inspiration at all. Or rather, the fans kept demanding new books from her. She was looking into other people's faces while walking in the park. She read other authors, watched different movies, went to exhibitions, but all in vain. Her head was empty. She had no more ideas. She couldn't think of a theme for her new book. Can I bring you the bill? The waiter couldn't understand why that woman was looking at him like that. No need. I'll finish my coffee. Come back later, Maria replied. Wait though. What's your name? The young man corrected his name tag, drawing the visitor's attention to him. Oliver said the woman's name thoughtfully. Go Oliver. You don't need to distract me now. When the young man obediently left, Maria began to type quickly, not the loud clatter of keys, but it echoed in the cool morning air, attracting the attention of the other few visitors at this time. The woman typed the following. The red-haired Oliver, having finished his waiter shift, stumbled upon something strange. Suddenly, in the darkness of the restaurant's pantry, he saw the writer hesitated, saw that. Well, what the hell, he could see in that damned pantry. Not the keyboard went silent, and the writer pounded her fist irritably on the table. Visitors turned again at the noise, but she didn't care. She drove on her chair, stared at the floor, took a deep breath, and nothing, no idea she had. Want to cry in annoyance, she erased everything she had written, and with a clatter she slammed the laptop shut, called the waiter back, and settled down and left the small cafe. Maria, you're home. Kevin, who had just arrived from work, started looking for his wife all over the house. Yes, she came out of the shower. I'll be right there. She is busy with only one bath towel, and the woman came out to meet her husband. He was holding a large bouquet of roses. She arched an eyebrow ironically. Those flowers meant that the husband was going somewhere. The man gave his wife a disgruntled look. Honey, when was the last time you had a facelift? Maria's eyes narrowed with resentment. You're totally nuts. What do you care? Angrily snapped at her. Then, after a little thought, she blurted out, trying to prick her husband even more painfully. You know you're the only one who doesn't like my uniform. Everyone else loves it. Kevin smiled broadly. The words she'd said didn't hurt him at all. Of course they are. You've got only little boys in your lover, though they love grown-up women. But the true beauty of a woman in the youth of freshness, dreamily said the older man, taking his eyes somewhere in the distance. But you know, Maria is furious. She wanted to say something else, but Kevin interrupted her. Sorry, don't be angry. It's just that sometimes I think of you as that other Maria, young and pretty. I'd give anything to get you back to your old self. He shook his head, as if chasing away a heavy fog. I'm just thinking out loud. Have you no shame, Kevin? The woman was completely shocked at such a statement. Yes, she knew very well that the older her husband got, the younger his mistresses were. The famous biologist was obsessed with youth and beauty, but to say such a thing to her face was unthinkable. No matter how it was very difficult to call the couple's relationship romantic. It was more like old good friends. In that case, he doesn't care about her looks. But you've got a nerve. The woman said aloud. Well, forgive me for loving you. I love you young. He was a little embarrassed. After a little silence, approached his wife and slipped her a bouquet. I'm leaving on business. I don't know how long I won't be missed. He kissed his wife on the forehead and abruptly turned around, walking away and interrupting their dialogue. Maria stood like that in her towel, clutching the gorgeous bouquet to her chest. It could not be said that she looked too old, nor was her age so deferential. Well, what is it for a well-groomed woman? 50 years old is the prime of life. Maria watched her diet carefully. She systematically practiced in the gym, was a regular at the cosmetologist and beauty salons. She was very careful about her appearance, and here it is that he allows himself. At the same time, the scientist himself was not frozen in his appearance. Although the couple were the same age, he looked much older than his years. He ate what he wanted. He drank, and he never exercised. He had already grown a belly. Maria stood by the mirror, not quite sure what emotion she was feeling. Certainly not. She hadn't cared about her husband's feelings for a long time. Maybe embarrassment was passing her by as well. Various thoughts were swirling around in her head, and it seemed an idea for a new book was beginning to emerge. Maria was afraid to move. It seemed to her that if she trembled, all her ideas would evaporate. She tried to catch the thought, to grab it at least by the tip, but that, like her husband, in the frying pan twisted out, and said maniac he kills only the young or only the old. Yes, the woman happily jumped up on the spot maniac alien from another planet, kills everyone over 40 years old, because he is sure that after this age people carry a deadly virus for the universe. Genius. The woman threw the bouquet on the floor and rushed to her computer, trying to play with the idea that had come unexpectedly. A couple of days later, Kevin left on another business trip, or maybe not. She didn't care. Seeing her husband Maria off, the gas pedal cocked his head. He put it that way, which was understandable. He was not going on business. He's taking some fool to a resort. Lucky her, Maria thought, but she did not resent her husband at all. All her thoughts were occupied with writing a new book. Since the departure of the scientist has already passed 3 days, and the writer has not even once left her home. She wrote night after night, afraid of losing her inspiration. She forgot to eat, drink, forgot even to go to the toilet. One day, the woman stood up abruptly from her desk and almost fainted. It would be better to rest, she realized, and allowed herself to leave the work on the book and take care of herself to the fullest. One of the days she devoted entirely to herself. She got a good night's sleep, went for a jog, had a delicious breakfast, and went to the beauty parlor. Her plans also included a Botox injection procedure, but the woman canceled them. Kevin's words seemed to have hurt her after all, and she didn't want to indulge his whims. The next day, the writer returned to her work. Rested, exhausted, she sat down at her computer and opened a draft of her new book, carried her slender fingers to the keyboard. And nothing. Inspiration had left Maria once again. She couldn't get a single word out of herself. She typed some text and then erased it. The sentences turned out to be not folded, silly, ugly, and even sometimes illiterate. Irritated woman got up from the table and decided to take a walk, already ready to go out into the world. Maria was putting on one of her favorite necklaces. Suddenly, there was a sharp beep and a sound. Maria knew a new message had come in. She rolled her eyes, sure of what her editor was writing. She picked up her phone, read the message, and suddenly the smartphone fell to the floor with a clatter. The woman was shaking. She had just read an incredibly strange, even frightening text message. It said, "Hello, Maria. You don't know I exist, but I know you exist. I'm your husband's mistress. And not just any lover, but the love of his life. I'm the one who keeps his secret, a terrible, unthinkable secret. Would you like to know it? Then come to Street Mary's tomorrow morning and go to the room of a patient named Smith. But before you come, think carefully. Are you ready to know what your husband is so carefully hiding?" Maria was completely shocked by the message she read. She squatted down, picking up the phone as it was strangely written in Russian. The woman thought, "Why is this fool writing me such strange texts? If right now she should be down on the beach in the arms of Kevin? I don't get it. The woman tried to dial the number from which the message came. The mechanical voice said that such a number did not exist. A cold sweat ran down Fantastica's back. She went out into the living room and sat down on the wide leather sofa. Some strange sound came from the street. Maria hovered in surprise. A terrible fear gripped her. She listened and realized it was the wind. What a scary thing, thought the woman. The recent text message had scared her. She thought about it. Of course, the couple had their detractors. Kevin had achieved unprecedented heights in his business. Of course, in building his career, he made a couple of 3 enemies. Maria herself knew that many of her colleagues were jealous of her. Maybe this message was just a cruel joke. The woman shuddered. She got up from the couch and went to lock the front and back doors, checked the security alarm just in case. Everything was working properly. She exhaled a sigh of relief. Apparently some loser writer is trying to scare me. The science fiction writer came to the obvious conclusion. Or maybe Kevin is being set up somehow. She pondered. Suddenly, she remembered one detail very important and very significant. The woman had heard such a name as St. Mary's Hospital many times, most importantly from her husband. A few months ago, Kevin decided to open his own clinic specializing in cancer. The scientist's mother died of cancer. He kept looking for a suitable head doctor, working on paperwork, trying to find the right place. Maria didn't keep much of an eye on her husband's business. And hospitals in general have always been intimidating to women. Did Kevin end up opening that clinic or not? The writer didn't know, or rather, she wasn't sure if he did. Why didn't he tell me? The woman thought. Maybe he did. Anna continued to ponder. In the end, finally confused, Lady went to the kitchen, pour herself a glass of wine. What mystery are we talking about? She took a couple of Gladcos. A pleasant warmth spread through her body. What are those skeletons in your closet? Oh, honey. The alcohol seemed to give her confidence. And the book writing's on hold. Maybe we should really go there. She got up quickly, went into her office, checked the clinic's address. Of course, deciding to do something like this was pretty hard. It might just be someone's stupid joke or provocation. Without noticing, the woman fell asleep at her desk, and next to her stood an unkilled large wine glass. Morning came, not understanding anything. Maria slowly lifted her head from her desk, embarrassed, wiping the corners of her mouth from saliva. Looked around, damn it, I fell asleep here again. Shouted the woman out loud. She stood up, heading for the bathroom. As suddenly the memories of last night came over the woman in a cold wave. She thought that message was just a figment of her imagination. Until she checked her cell phone. A gloomy and frightening text message as cheerful as the incoming one. Her mind was jumbled. Just yesterday, the woman had been ready to drive there headlong, but today fear gripped her with renewed vigor. What if it was a trap? Or the other way around, someone's stupid joke? She showered, washed her face, made her favorite coffee. The mysterious stranger asked her to come to the right room in the morning. It must be for a reason. There wasn't much time left. Of course, it would be right to just call her spouse and find out from him after all. They had nothing to hide from each other. But in Maria's soul, like a small seed, sprouted some strange feeling, a hunch, suspicion, intuition. It was some sixth sense. Maria had long suspected that Kevin had something to hide. The decision had been made, and the woman was already ordering a cab. Eating her coffee in a hurry. The driver opened the door. Maria stepped out of the car valiantly, heading straight for the main entrance of this brand new clinic. While the writer was in the cab, she managed to make a couple of inquiries. St. Mary's Hospital was indeed her husband's. That was what the first link on the search browser said. She opened several others. All the media as one wrote about the swanky new clinic opened by the famous Russian biologists. She did not resent her husband for not inviting her to the opening of his clinic. Kevin was well aware of the woman's fear of doctors and hospitals. The door slammed shut, and she walked toward the front desk. She smiled softly, called out the correct last name, the last name Smith. To herself, the woman smirked at how original Smith was. The young female employee was smiling at something, checking something on her computer. She was a young girl with long blonde clean-cut hair. She was incredibly beautiful, but seemed rather silly. Kavinka must be sleeping with her. Maria thought to herself and asked aloud, "You're new, right?" "Oh yes." The girl smiled in a friendly smile. Her voice sounded melodious, and she smelled like a sweet, sweet perfume. "How did you guess?" "I'm new to this place and I'm not quite up to date." The girl was embarrassed by her candor. "I guessed." The woman continued to smile feignedly. "So you'll show me to the right room?" "Just a second." She continued to put on the computer mouse. "You're just in time for our visiting hours in the morning. Follow me." The girl left the counter, heading for the elevator. She was followed by a trail of sweet perfume. "There's Mrs. Smith's room at the end of the hall." The staff member pointed to the door in question. "And this is your daughter?" Gently inquired the girl with feigned sadness in her voice. Maria was taken aback. She had spoken to both daughters as recently as yesterday. "Both are perfectly fine. And they have different last names. Certainly not the caricatured last name Smith. What makes you think my daughter's lying there?" "What do you mean?" "But you look exactly the same," the young girl simply replied. She was a little embarrassed. "I'm sorry for your loss. A brain tumor is a terrible disease." Maria didn't know what to think. Not only was this girl not at all tactful, but who says that to the relatives of a seriously ill patient? And she was talking nonsense. She decided not to get into a verbal altercation with this boorish one, only gestured to her that she was free to go. The writer approached the door, took the handle, and, holding her breath, opened the hospital door. Behind the door, she expected to see many things, but certainly not what was actually there. In a nice single room lay a young girl. She was lying sideways. You couldn't see her face. Her whole body was cramped. Her limbs were assuming unnatural postures. A chill ran down Maria's back. That stranger was agonizing in pain. She was squirming, making sounds that no other living thing on this planet seemed capable of making. Fear enveloped the writer. She had never seen such agony anywhere. It felt as if the devil were being driven out of the young girl. She was unnaturally perishing. Screaming Maria suddenly felt that in this ward literally smells of death. The turbulent imagination of the writer immediately drew a picture in which behind the closed curtains of this ward is already waiting for its hour. Death with a scythe. She was afraid to breathe, afraid to move. The horror lodged deep in the poor woman's chest. She couldn't fight the fear. She ran out of the room, holding her heart. When the door slammed shut, Maria slid down the wall hard. Who's that? What's wrong with this poor girl, she thought. Maria was sure that in this universe there was no such terrible and horrible disease that could torment people so much. She brushed away the incoming tears, her chest constricted with pain and compassion for the stranger. Maria was just about ready to leave, as suddenly remembered about the text message, because it said that in this ward her spouse kept some terrible secret. The writer's first thought was that maybe Kevin had created some terrible virus. It took her a few long minutes to calm the trembling in her knees and find the strength to rise to her feet. She pulled herself together and went back into that room, covering her nose and lips with a hospital mask. The girl was still in the same agony, but the cramps had let up a little. Maria slowly approached, wanting to question the unfortunate woman. She approached, peering then and there into her face, and was literally dazed with amazement. In her eyes froze all-consuming horror. Hair stood up and seemed to instantly gray. On the hospital bed lay Maria herself, only younger than 30 years. Her eyes darkened, her hands shook, and her heart raced. The woman, forgetting her makeup, wiped her eyes, pinched herself on the arm. She squirmed and opened her eyes abruptly. Her exact replica still lay before her. The young Maria was squirming in pain, having never noticed the unthrown visitor. Obviously, from the pain, she had no strength at all. The writer raised her voice, dry and quiet, almost without vitality. How is that possible? Who are you? The patient, finally noticing her guest, looked up at her behind her misty eyes as if blown away. It seemed to her that she was looking in the mirror of some enchanted mirror, carrying a reflection far into the past. You dropped the girl abruptly. She tried to rise up on her elbows, but the pain made her lie back down. That's what I'll become. She was silent for a few seconds and then spoke with an effort. If I live. Fear froze in young Maria's eyes. She seemed dumbfounded by the encounter. No less than the writer herself. The women took a long look at each other's faces. What do you mean? Finally, Maria inquired hoarsely. She saw how much the young girl was agonizing in pain. But she couldn't help but question this mysterious stranger. The girl's eyes raced around the room. She clapped nervously, gaining a more realized look. Where is Kevin? Asked the sick woman. There was no way the writer could take away the anxiety settling in her chest. She desperately tried to find an explanation for this phenomenon. Maybe this girl is really her daughter. Maybe the maternity hospital had mixed up the babies. Judging by the patient's age, she was in her early 20s. It was the same age as Maria and Kevin's youngest daughter. The woman asked what your name was. Same as you. The girl shouted back at me, it's you. Don't you get it? I'm your clone, your bloody copy. Maria was speechless. Her pulse throbbed, giving itself away in the temples of Kimi's goal with blows. That yes, Kevin created me. I was cloned. I'm your clone. The writer became dizzy. Unable to stay on her feet any longer, she flopped menacingly onto the hospital bed. She instantly remembered how very young Vano literally raved about the topic of cloning. He had gotten the idea back in '96, when the first cloned animal, Dolly the sheep, had been revealed to the world. Kevin was clearly convinced that humanity has been cloning since the early 2000s. People are just carefully hiding it. He was vividly interested in stories about rich people paying unimaginable money to bring a dead relative back to life, or even to recreate an exact copy of a celebrity. He was firmly convinced that somewhere in this world a clone of Elvis Presley was growing. The biologist often repeated that he himself would someday realize the idea of cloning a human being. He lived with this idea, he cherished and nurtured it. Maria herself only waved away her husband's fantasies, although she herself was able to fantasize vigorously. No matter how you look at it, she was not just a writer, but a science fiction writer. But the idea of human cloning had never appealed to her. Maria thought that such a thing, although possible, but not realizable at all. She'd seen a science program on the subject, and from the point of view of morality, it seemed unthinkable to her. How can a man live if he knows he's not himself? It is inhuman. It is unethical. It is criminal, finally, she said. But the latter dismissively waved away, nothing you do not understand in science. He replied. At some point, Kevin stopped all talk of cloning on the route. Having become a little older than 30 years old, having already reached a certain status in his profession, the man stopped raving about cloning. It happened one day after the next scientific award he received. The topic of cloning became a real taboo in the family. Probably he grew up, moved on, thought the biologist's wife. After a while, she herself forgot about how much her husband wanted to reach the heights of genetics. So that's what you are? I asked in a whisper, shocked Maria. She sat with that girl on the same hospital bed and looked at her face in surprise. The same moles, the same features, even the structure of her teeth. Maria has had a gap in her upper front row since she was a child. She is my exact copy. She can't be my daughter. She is. I'm the one who thought she was. At the same time, the young Maria perked up. Her eyes flashed with rage. She screamed at the top of her voice. And yet I'm not you. I'm a different person altogether. The young girl folded in pain and howled in an unnatural voice. The hands of her arms twisted, her long fingers convulsively spreading her legs into a bedpost. Her voice sounded so desperate, so loud. It was like the howl of a wild animal, not the voice of a human being in any way. Her entire bed was wet with sweat. Her body was glistening. There seemed to be steam coming off the girl. She obviously had a very high fever. She kept screaming. Some of the fragments of phrases were completely incomprehensible. Some Maria could make out. She was screaming. I can't live like this. I don't want to live like this. Kill me, kill me. Desperate sobs were in her voice. It seemed as if she would fly up and melt into the cargo air. The sight was so gruesome that the writer felt nauseous. Screams echoed throughout the hospital. After a couple minutes, several people showed up on the doorstep of the room. You help me, help me." Maria yelled in the same unnatural and hysterical voice. She screamed, and the words seemed to be lost in space. The general state of hysteria deprived both Maria and her clone of reason for a while. But it was the writer who was already screaming. She herself did not quite understand what she wanted from these people. When her consciousness cleared a little, she looked more closely at those who had come and froze with an expression of wild horror on her face. There were 5 people in the room, all of them wearing full face masks and wide white suits. The masks were thick. Unusually shaped, they resembled a plague doctor's mask. The white elongated eyes covering the head completely were hidden behind 2 round lenses. Their suits resembled hospital gowns, but were tighter. More, rather even resembled a suit. Disinfection. Maria was afraid to move. With some sixth sense, she realized that these people were the real villains. "Who are you? What's going on here?" The writer's voice had already lost its edge. She looked hopefully at these people, but they were silent. The expression on their faces was not visible. But Maria clearly knew they were angry. 2 of them came close to her, grabbed her arms, lifting the unfortunate writer off the floor. The 3rd and 4th picked Maria up by her feet. The 5th moved to open the door. What do you think you're doing?" "Maria, what the hell are you doing?" "Help, help," she screamed, hoping for someone else. A real doctor would save her, snatch her from the clutches of those horrible creatures. She kept screaming, twitching her legs, trying to wriggle out of their clutches. But it was all in vain. When the mysterious people lowered her back to the 1st floor, Maria cast a hopeful glance at the reception desk. There sat that new girl. She might be able to help, but the reception desk was empty. It seemed that all the staff had died out and only these 5 creatures remained within the walls of the clinic. Maria and her terrifying clone. The woman fell silent after her own screaming ceased to dwarf her. She realized within the walls of this hospital there was a ringing silence. No voices, no noise of instruments. Only the rustle of white suits echoed through the corridors of the clinic. They brought her to some other room and held her tightly as Maria suddenly felt a needle. It went painfully into her skin, and the woman lost consciousness. She woke up. Maria was lying in a hospital bed. There was a drip sticking out of the vein on her arm. My head was bursting with a terrible migraine. She looked next to me. No one was there. The writer tried to rise on her elbows, but alas, the woman had no strength either. She felt disgusting. Her body felt dull, her head was dizzy and sore. So every heartbeat echoed painfully in the woman's body. The throbbing headache was increasing with every second. Her stomach twisted against her throat. Nausea came up. "What? Where am I?" Maria asked that question to the depths of her room. Even though there was no one around, the woman did not lose hope that someone would come and explain to her how I was here. The writer continued to question. Inner thoughts, like puzzles, began to form a picture of the recent past. Here she received a text message. Here she was at her husband's clinic. Like bright flashes, the woman kept remembering and remembering what had happened. She remembered the suspicious men in suits. She remembered her clone. Despite the pain, the adrenaline, she jumped up and sat up in her bunk. Immediately, she threw up right on the hospital floor. Her head buzzed, her body racked with sticky, nasty fear. The door of the room opened, and Maria's heart nearly stopped from fright. "Misse, have you come to your senses?" A tall, elderly woman entered the room, her long, tight black skirt concealed by a hospital gown, and she wore square-rimmed glasses with gray lenses over her eyes. Her gray hair was gathered in a lovely bun. "Who are you? Where am I? Are they gone? Where is that girl?" Maria's voice sounded eerily quiet. She resembled one of the patients of a mental hospital. Hair shot up. Her gaze was full of madness. The doctor adjusted her glasses. She looked concerned. She raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Who exactly are you talking about? Those people in the weird suits? Where did they go? Did you catch them? The gray-haired doctor took air into her lungs. She answered, but with her whole appearance, she made it clear that the dialogue annoyed her. "Missus, where are you now? I'm at St. Mary's Hospital." The writer perked up, distributing her shoulders. "By the way, this is my husband's clinic. Explain yourself at once." "This is the first time I've heard of a hospital by that name." The attending physician corrected her glasses. "You are at Toronto Central City Hospital. Don't you remember how you got here?" Aya, Maria suddenly realized that she really didn't remember how she'd gotten here. Her last memory was cut off at the moment when one of those strange men gave her an injection. And beyond that, there was a void. The writer exhaled heavily. "I really don't remember how I could have gotten here, you know. I was attacked. Do you have to call the police?" "We do. I've seen it." The doctor tired, rubbed, carried, put her glasses back on, adjusting them with one index finger. "You were found lying right in the city park by the lake? Were you unconscious? A couple of awkward movements, and you could have drowned. People passing by called an ambulance. They took you to the nearest hospital." Her voice became noticeably softer and her tone more conciliatory. It sounded like she was talking to a retarded person. "Have your loved ones been notified? Your husband will be here soon, and he will be billed. She's a little different. Given your diagnosis, it's no wonder you fainted. Give me the name of the doctor you've been seeing." Maria got nervous. Her pulse cleared, her hands shook visibly. Memories not abandoned immediately arose in her mind. The image of the man the woman was so desperate to forget arose. The writer had always hated hospitals. She couldn't stand the white coats and perfectly clean patient rooms. Even in early childhood, when Maria was no more than 11 years old, her mother became seriously ill. The girl spent 24 hours a day with her in hospitals, not wanting to let her mom go even for a minute. The treatment was long, hard. But little Maria, for any money, was not ready to leave the hospital walls. And although the hospital atmosphere depresses her, and the girl could not sleep at home alone without her mother. One day, during a visit to her mother, a terrible thing happened. She left the room and went to the toilet. And then someone grabbed her by the arm and took her away to the nearest utility room. The girl was numb with horror. She didn't even try to scream. She was in such shock that she almost fainted. When the door of the tiny room slammed shut, she saw her captor. He was a heavy-set, older man. He was wearing a white robe. His head was hidden under a medical hood. He held the little girl roughly with one hand. With the other, he put his index finger to her lips. "What do you want, doctor?" Stammering, the girl asked. The man did not answer, only began to forcibly undress the 11-year-old child. Fortunately, Maria found the strength to scream at the top of her voice and dropped something heavy, making a terrible noise. The staff reacted quickly, saved the girl from a terrible accident. That pervert wasn't a doctor at all. He sneaked into the hospital and dressed in a uniform so he wouldn't be suspected. After that day, the girl was panic-stricken both of doctors and hospitals themselves. When her mother recovered, she spent fabulous sums of money to cure the child of this fear. Maria, startled, immediately became dizzy. But she found the strength to say the following: "Please help me. Go to St. Mary's." Asked to be escorted to Mrs. Smith's room. "I beg you, I'll pay any money." But I couldn't imagine such a thing. I just couldn't imagine it. The doctor seemed to think about it, already excited that this woman would confirm her words. And Clooney jumped on the spot from a sudden and loud sound. "Maria, dear," I flew as soon as I could. Kevin appeared in the doorway. What happened? He rushed to the hospital bed, which had been standing by the window all this time. The doctor took a couple steps toward the man. "Mister, what an honor. Tell me, do you know anything about St. Mary's? Did your wife have some horrible fantasy about it? Maybe something scared her there, shortly before she was hospitalized." Kevin was silent for a couple of long seconds, his eyes darting around. He unconsciously began to rub the edge of his jacket. After a moment's thought, he nonchalantly threw back, "No. That's the first I've heard of it." And he turned to his wife again. "How are you? How are you feeling? Kevin, you said you were going to open a hospital for cancer patients. That's the name you kept repeating. Why do you say this is the first time you've heard of it? The scientist reacted instantly. He theatrically clutched his head. "Oh, my poor thing. Why are we being punished like this?" "My dear, don't worry, we'll definitely cure you." "Kevin, answer," insisted the writer. "Marinochka, my soul. It's meningitis. It's poisoning. Your brain is poisoning." He shifted his gaze to the doctor. "I'm a distinguished biologist. I'm a doctor of sciences. But I have little to do with practical medicine." "Why do I need a clinic?" The doctor, without answering, left the room. Before leaving, she cast a puzzled glance at Maria for a second. It seemed to the writer that she believed her. She began to hope that this woman would waste her time and go to that very clinic to search for the truth. Kevin wouldn't stop. Well, Nina and Molly's Manners had already arrived. No, they weren't here yet. Maria seemed to be looking at her husband's face. He was expressing his concern. But she had noticed in that first second, when the doctor had asked him uncomfortable questions, the woman had noticed how nervous he had gotten, how his pupils had narrowed. Maybe it was really all because of the disease, but for some reason Maria was sure that her husband was deceiving her long ago and meanly. "Treatment? Is there a treatment?" asked Kevin. "I don't know anything." "Honey," answered Maria tiredly. "Ask the doctors." Maria was getting worse every day. Her illness was progressing. She was increasingly confused by her own memories in her mind. She changed hospitals, changed doctors, but no one could help the poor woman. Maria's daughters never left their mother's side. Kevin, in turn, also spent a lot of time with his wife. Doctors gave a disappointing prognosis of the writer. They promised a couple months of life at most, so bad were her affairs. A couple of weeks after the woman learned about her terrible disease, relatives of the family flew to them on an emergency flight. The door to the room opened. "Hello, Maria." The first to enter the room was an elderly man. On his head, he wore a small black hat with round brim. His eyes were hidden behind sunglasses, and he was holding a cane. "How are you?" The pale man had lost a lot of weight. Maria lifted his head. Although only a little time had passed, but the once young writer's health, the woman was unrecognizable. She had stopped, lost a dozen pounds. There was no trace left of the hollowness of her hair. The woman had lost some of her hair. Creepy dark bags formed under her eyes, her face covered with decrepit skin. Even beauty injections did not help the poor woman retain her former youthful appearance. Lack of movement also made itself felt. The whole body became loose skin moved. If earlier the writer looked much younger than her years, now it was a real old woman. She took a long look at the face. A man unable to at least answer him. It was Andrew, her husband's older brother. She had expected her relatives to come to say goodbye to her, but in no way this man. She stretched weakly. "As you can see badly." "Man." You man smiled, stepped closer to her. He was followed by two other men. Lucy, Maria's younger sister, and her niece Kate. Lucy couldn't hold back, crying bitterly. Young Kate pulled her mother to her side, calming her down. "Calm down first, then come back." The writer threw them in her heart. She'd had enough of all the tears and pity over the last couple of weeks. Yes, I'm sorry," Lucy replied. She took her daughter under her arm and left the room for a while. Only her husband's brother remained next to Maria. "Are you going to weep with irony in your voice?" asked the woman. The man smiled back. In fact, their relationship could not be called warm. Andrew was, like Maria herself, a writer. True, he never managed to achieve success. He squinted and calmly replied, "No, I won't. Although, seeing you really makes it hard to keep from crying." What is it like for Kevin to see his wife in such a state? He's an aesthete. He loves with his eyes. Maria could have gotten angry, but she had no strength left for such an energy-consuming emotion. Her whole body was pulling. Nausea was not leaving the poor woman. Her eyes were foggy, and her coordination was impaired. Maria could no longer move on her own. "I'm almost a walking corpse. Or rather, lying down," she added snidely. "And you're worried about my appearance and your brother's feelings? Tell me why you're here," she demanded. The older man stirred, adjusted his hat. He looked like he wanted to take off his sunglasses, but changed his mind. Look, you have such a fan base, don't you? I don't mean to make a big deal out of it, but you probably won't need your fans anymore. So I thought you were out of your mind. Maria was shocked to hear that. According to you, readers are just an expendable resource that can be sold. Just like that. Their love has to be earned. They have to be interested. What do? That's why no one reads you. I can feel it right away. But don't get upset. The man raised his hands in a conciliatory manner. I just thought I could write under your name. Judge for yourself, you don't need it all anymore, and readers will be happy that you've supposedly recovered from your illness. Maria laughed. Her voice was weak, broken hoarse, and exhalation took from the woman the last drops of strength. You'll never be able to write the way I did. Don't talk nonsense. I'll never agree to that. And after I'm dead, don't even try. Go on, get out of here. This conversation is over. The man stood up, adjusting his suit. Well then, after you're dead, I'll be talking to Kevin. He walked towards the door, but when his hand had already touched the knob, Maria called out to him. Did you hear about Kevin opening his clinic? What do you think of his idea? Andrew stopped, answered without turning around. I heard. I'm not interested. Let him do what he wants. The door slammed shut behind him. Maria thought deeply. Maybe all those events were true. Every time the writer brought up the subject, her husband squeamishly waved her away. He kept saying, "You're hallucinating." I never had any clinic. People in scary white coats are clones. What the hell are you talking about? The woman, though reluctantly, believed that everything that had happened to her was just a figment of her imagination. Though somewhere deep inside she realized that those events were very real. Lucy brought her out of her own thoughts. A woman who had already come to her senses. She came into the room. Kate and her daughters Maria, Nina, and Molly followed her in. What Uncle wanted? Anxious? Asked Nina. Nina's eldest daughter had just recently married a Canadian, but her mother's terrible illness had completely thrown her out of her happily married life. Forget it. The writer tossed it carelessly. Please, let's not talk about me. Tell me more about yourselves. The girls began to tell her about the events of their lives. The writer was happy. She wanted so much to forget about her own problems and forget about her terrible disease even for a second, but to feel herself an ordinary happy person, at least to imagine herself like that. She listened to Lucy with interest. She had recently been promoted to the position of director. Kate was also doing well. The girl entered the budget department, the faculty of journalism. The youngest daughter, Maria Molly, also achieved success in her life. She won a grant to study at a prestigious college in Great Britain. Only the eldest daughter, Nina, remained. The girl was upset and was silent about her life. Nina, why don't you say anything? I can see by the look on your face that something's happened. I hope something good, she asked her daughter. She corrected her dress and said, Mom, well, now is not the time for my news. It's the right time, the woman replied. Well, already say what is it? Nina smiled gently, touched her belly with her hand. Mom, I'm pregnant. Tears came to Maria's eyes. Forgetting about her pain, she got up from the bed and hugged her daughter tightly. This news gave the writer new hope. Her daughter's pregnancy really gave Maria new strength, learning that very soon she will become a grandmother. The writer began a real, ruthless struggle with her illness. She promised herself that she would definitely cope, swore not only to herself, she promised it to her future grandson. A couple weeks later, she was on the mend. The doctors were amazed along with all Maria's relatives. Such a dramatic recovery was a real miracle. No one understood how it happened that a patient who had been given no more than a couple of months to live so briskly went on the mend. Some said it was a miracle of God. Some marveled at the doctor's abilities. Others said it was Maria herself. The woman finally found the strength to fight the disease. She took matters into her own hands and thus cured herself by the power of thought. It's hard to say who was right, but nevertheless, the fact remained. Maria was cured of her serious illness. A couple of hours before the writer was discharged, Mrs. A had an unexpected visitor. It's good to see you. The woman entered the room. She was not wearing the hospital gown, but on this woman it was immediately obvious. She's a professional. You sincerely surprised Maria. She had been in another hospital for a long time. She expected to see anyone but her past attending physician. Yes, I answered the woman calmly. Her gray hair was still gathered into a lovely bundle. The modest clothes made the woman look unremarkable. I have something to share with you, something important. Her voice sounded more serious than ever. She stared intently into Maria's face. Yes, I'm listening. I'm sorry. How can I address you? The writer asked. Mrs. Brown. The doctor replied. I'm sorry. We don't have time for small talk. Promise me you'll keep this conversation between us. Yes, of course. Maria slammed her eyes shut in surprise. She didn't understand what could have been required of her. That and Mrs. Brown. And what was so secret she was going to share with her. Listen carefully. You told me so convincingly about your accident that even I, an inveterate skeptic, could almost believe you. And of course, I knew right away that your husband was lying. I'm good at sensing other people's emotions. She was silent for a moment. Then she fixed her already inviting hair and continued. Of course, I couldn't take your word for it. Especially given your diagnosis. But your husband, I'm sorry, but he's definitely hiding something. Anyway, your story really hit me, so I went to see the place you were talking about. Well, have you seen her? Maria stepped forward in fascination. She had forgotten that she had shared this secret with the doctor at the other hospital. Memories of men in white suits, painfully pricking her, and then there was that horribly sick girl, her clone. Maria was about to believe that she had really imagined it all. No, I didn't see anything. The woman lowered her voice. That's very strange. After your story, I went straight to the internet. Indeed, St. Mary's Hospital belonged to a famous biologist. That is, your husband. I saved the address of the hospital and was going to go there on my day off. A couple days later, I went there, and you wouldn't believe what happened there. The writer's heart really hammered. There was a construction site. The builders were tearing down some building. I thought I'd come to the wrong place, checked the address. It was right. I opened the internet again, and there was not a single word about this clinic. Not a single word, not a single link. Someone, probably someone very powerful, had deleted all the data about it. This clinic has been demolished. I can't believe what I'm hearing. Maria's heavily sedated on the bed. You're not fooling me. You believe me? With hope in your voice? Asked the writer. Maybe I don't fully believe that your husband really created a clone. It's quite difficult scientifically. But I'm pretty sure he's hiding something, and it's not cheating at all. Or are your favorites accidentally thrown away? Perfume is something terrible, something scary. Also, almost immediately after I went to the address of that clinic, your husband Kevin came to see me. Oh God, why? Of course, he didn't talk about everything out in the open. Mrs. Brown sat down carefully on the edge of her chair, but he was visibly nervous. He comes straight to my house, asking about where I'd been at the weekend, supposedly seeing me in a restaurant and being too shy to approach me. I mean, he was talking nonsense. But when he left, he said something that made my hair stand on end. He told me to remember what happens to people who mind their own business. He said it with a smile on his face, but I knew right away he was a scary man. My God. Maria slowly brought her hand to her face and wiped her eyes. She, of course, knew that her spouse is a man unusual and even extravagant, but what would be something she remembered? She went to look for her smartphone. A surprised Mrs. Brown asked, "What are you looking for?" "I should have that text," shouted Maria back. Finally, a break. All her belongings, she discovered her phone. Opened the message in surprise, her eyes rounded. The message was gone. Someone had deleted it. Mrs. Brown asked what was in that text message. "You didn't tell me about it?" Maria briefly recounted the content of that frightening message. The women looked at each other. The doctor was the first to speak. "Could your husband have taken your phone while you were sleeping, for example?" "He just deleted the message." "That's all." "No way," thoughtfully replied the writer. "I have a strong, complex password. No one knows it. I myself sometimes forget it. My phone is very private. He couldn't have gotten into it so easily. So someone else is involved." The doctor concluded. Someone who could get into your device remotely deleted it. It's probably the same people who deleted it. And the clinic has all the data. And before Mrs. Brown could finish, Kevin appeared in the doorway. Maria, you're you. He looked surprised. What are you doing here? Lady, the doctor smiled softly, rising from her seat. I've come to visit a former patient of mine. I heard that Mrs. A is on the mend. Isn't that a real miracle? I'm so glad the disease has receded. She walked quickly to the door without letting the man answer. Thank you for seeing me. I wish you a speedy recovery. She cast one last meaningful glance at Maria and left the room. Gee, what a bunch of clingers, Kevin muttered. So what did she say to you? Maria wanted to tell her husband what she thought of him. But what Mrs. Brown said frightened the woman. She decided to lie about nothing of interest. She was asking about the medication I'd been prescribed, probably trying to figure out how I'd beaten the meningitis. Al waved his hand nonchalantly. I hope you didn't tell her. Their hospital, of course, is a nightmare. It's a good thing we got you here in time. It really is. Let's go home. Let's go, Kevin. Taking the bag with his things, the couple walked forward. Maria followed him. Her hands were shaking, her legs were kicking up. It turned out that she did not know her husband at all. Who are you? Maria asked herself. In the near future, she was destined to deal with what this mad scientist was hiding. Maria soon recovered fully from her illness. She happily returned to writing her book. A little longer it could be released into the world. The couple's life hadn't changed at all. Not changed only at first glance. Kevin still led his ordinary life the same way. He worked, he vacationed a lot, changed his mistresses like a glove. He traveled a lot. Maria began to really fear her husband. She looked at him with different eyes. What are you so carefully hiding? The woman asked herself this question. Fortunately, her husband did not notice the change in his wife's behavior. It seemed to him that their family life has not changed in any way. But for Maria, the whole world turned upside down. One day she tried to follow her husband, but all in vain. Kevin always left by some strange, confusing ways to follow his car was almost impossible for her. At some point, the woman decided to give up for a while the idea of solving the biologist's terrible mystery. First, she wanted to recover. She took up sports again, started visiting beauty salons again. Already 8 months after the woman went on the mend, she was back to her former state of hair. Her weight was restored, her skin tightened, and her muscles reappeared on her body. Everything was really going the way it used to. However, the thought that her husband could have turned out to be a real maniac did not give the writer any rest. One day, Maria and her eldest daughter went to the movies together. They had already seen the movie and went for a walk in Central Park. Nina was pregnant with a huge belly, attracting the attention of people passing by. Strangers now and then stopped to look at the face of the beautiful and pregnant girl. Oh, I can't wait to see my granddaughter, dreamily said Maria. Recently, the family found out that Nina was expecting a girl. That's for sure. Although, I'm so used to the belly. I don't know how I'll be without it. Nina smiled, rubbing her lower back. You'll be fine without it. It's such a relief, the woman replied. What did you think of the movie? I liked it a lot. Nina was smiling with her mouth full. My favorite Ryan Gosling was in it. By the way, did you notice how much my husband looks like him? Maria laughed warmly, shaking her head. Don't make it up. Nothing in common at all. He does. It's just that you don't notice. Not on the offender pouted her lips. Mom and her daughter walked a little more, and tiredly plumped down on the nearest bench. It was already hard to be on his feet for a long time. My back hurt. It's not like that. You just like to think so. Maria smiled. She missed such simple and easy communication. She kept counting in response. There was some noise from behind. Nina did not pay attention to it. She continued to tell her mother something. But Maria unknowingly turned around. What she saw shocked her. A little farther outside the park stood Ryan Gosling. The writer knew that the actor was from Canada, but to be right in the middle of the street like that, she squinted and realized what it was that made her so confused. How's that? You're not his mom. Did you steal this baby? He laughed, for God's sake. This is my granddaughter. Fantastica was the first to answer proudly. The man was genuinely surprised. How is it a granddaughter? You're so young. It can't be. Thank you. Maria nodded her head, imitating a bow. And your husband? I don't have a husband anymore. I am free as the wind. The man smiled. Then let me introduce myself, Alex. I'm a journalist. And you, Maria, he frowned. She thought she had once heard a faint accent in his speech. Alex, where are you from? You're not Canadian, are you? How'd you figure me out so fast? Yes, I emigrated 40 years ago. I'm from Belarus. Maria was pleasantly surprised. She'd never paid attention to men her own age before. All of the writer's lovers were young, green guys. But this man, although he was noticeably older, she was charmed. And she was interested in her profession as a journalist. She, giving her voice a flirtatious tone, introduced herself. He laughed. Well, how would you like to have lunch somewhere? I happily replied Maria. She was delighted to make such an interesting and even unusual acquaintance. A romance began between the writer and the journalist. It seemed to them that they had known each other all their lives. Their communication was so easy and so good, they could talk for hours on end. It seemed that they had a lot in common and their professions were very similar. They chatted, walked, learned more and more details about each other. After a while, Maria, who had already realized that Alex could be trusted, told him about the incident. She told him that she had seen her own clone, told him about those people in suits, told him about how that sinister clinic had disappeared without a trace, how she had seen the clone of a popular actor. The writer was prepared for Alex to think she was crazy. She was prepared that the man would only laugh at her, not taking it all seriously. But the journalist's reaction surprised Maria. He listened attentively to the whole story, frowning thick black eyebrows. Believed every word Maria said. Not for a second doubted the truth of her words. You know, I've encountered similar things, Alex said thoughtfully. The couple sat in the far corner of the restaurant veranda. They didn't want their conversation to be overheard. Yes, tell me. The writer, who sat opposite him at a small table, moved forward. Recently, a young man came to our editorial office. He was handsome, like Apollo. Incredibly attractive appearance. We all looked at him without taking our eyes off him. This kid had brought some notes, wanted to publish his manuscripts. There was this book, you know, amazing. It was called It's Hard to Be a Clone. I didn't realize it at the time. Danya, are you kidding me? Maria, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Where is he now? Who did he look like? Where are those tapes? Ah, Alex grabbed his head. If I had known back then his manuscript was just awful. Well, you have to understand, no syllable, no talent. We turned the guy around after all, in our business on looks alone. As the young man walked away resentfully, one of his coworkers noticed a suspicious resemblance. He looked exactly like Alain Delon. Only when he was young, we went on the internet, found a photo and all aghast. It was the same face. We realized we started calling the young man. It could have been a great report, but the phone was no longer available. And we never saw him again. Soon everything was forgotten, and we never remembered that incident. But if you compare that story to what you told me, it's amazing. And that book, where it is, we should read it. Maybe there will be answers to our questions there. Alex exhaled sadly. Alas, sweetheart. The boy took his sketches away. We didn't even read half of it because it was so bad. Who knew it would turn out to be such an important piece of evidence? Maria leaned back in her chair. For a second, she thought the clue was so close, but the mystery of Kevin was once again distant from her. She stretched tiredly not to find out what this psychopath was hiding. Alex snapped his fingers playfully. Don't get upset. Honey, we'll figure it out. I promised you. The lovers took up the investigation. They tried to find out where Kevin lives now, but all to no avail. It was as if he had simply vanished. He was neither in the laboratory, nor in any of his and Maria's apartments or houses, as if the man had never existed. He had simply vanished. When they realized they couldn't solve the case on their own, Alex suggested the logical option of going to the police. Maria only shook her head dejectedly in response. "Do you want us to be put in a madhouse?" she asked. Even though the journalist had his own good connections, he couldn't turn to them. The case was too peculiarly bizarre. He did not want influential people to twist a finger at his temple, pointing at him and his chosen one. One night, Maria was reminded of a very important and intelligent person, Mrs. Brown. Since the day of her discharge, Maria had never seen a doctor. And after all, that was a great omission. Little wonder that women would be able to think of what to do next. The very next day, Maria went to the hospital where the doctor worked. She found out the schedule of her shifts at the reception desk and waited for Mrs. Brown after work like a maniac. Finally, Dr. Brown appeared from behind the wide doors. "Mrs. Brown, good evening. Do you recognize me?" The writer equaled the woman and went toe to toe with her. She didn't know where they were going, but she tried to keep up. The doctor turned around fearfully, afraid that their conversation might have been overheard. And she quietly answered without slowing down. "Mrs., did you find out anything?" "Yes, not exactly. May I invite you to a private conversation? I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask for your support." Mrs. Brown stopped abruptly. She looked around again and whispered, "What sort of support? Don't take this the wrong way, but I'm an ordinary doctor. I'm not likely to be of any help." "What's with the hope in your voice, though?" Maria asked. She herself did not notice how she clung to the hand of her interlocutor. "My husband is an investigator. If you need to run something through the database or find something, I could ask him to do it. I don't promise it will work," but the writer, without letting the woman finish her speech, gustily shouted out "thank you," and immediately restrained himself under the judgmental gaze of the doctor. She continued, "Suggest we meet tomorrow. I just have a day off. I'll give you the address. Come straight to my house. My husband will not be at home, and you will calmly tell me what you have found out. We'll see if there's anything I can do to help you." She was silent for a moment, considering her words. Then she took a sheet of paper and a pen out of her purse and quickly wrote the address on it. It was so no one could delete it. A handwritten letter is more reliable than an email. "I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. Now, if you'll excuse me." And the doctor left in a different direction with a quick step. Maria, hiding the piece of paper with the address well, hailed a cab and drove home. Her heart skipped a couple of thudding beats. It seemed the clue was closer than ever. The very next day, Maria went to visit her new old acquaintance. Though nervous, she recounted all the recent events to the doctor quite intelligently and without clarifying anything from her. She also mentioned her new acquaintance Alex, telling her and his mysterious story. Mrs. Brown wiped her chin thoughtfully. Then she said, "No offense, but I don't believe Kevin is clandestinely breeding clones. Think about it. In the case of those same actors, it would have to be at least 16 or 20 years. Humans, even clones, don't grow that fast. I don't think he has access to some kind of human growth gas pedal. This is something on the verge of mysticism or fantasy." Maria smiled tiredly back at Mrs. Brown. "This whole story is on the verge of fantasy." The doctor shook his head. "I'll try to help you. You said Kevin mentioned that he has been living in another house for a long time. My husband will be able to look in his database to see which property, even the one your spouse is actively hiding. I think I can give you the address you need. Well, beyond that, I don't know how else I can help you. Maybe your husband will send out a posse, but there's not much we can find." "No way." Mrs. Brown has raised her voice. "I'm not going to talk about the whole fantasy of this story. In a case like this, you don't need a lot of ears. I'll just tell him that a friend of mine suspects her husband of adultery, or something like that until something more concrete comes to light. You can't bring other people into this." "You're probably right," Maria said quietly. "This whole story is too unrealistic." But there, the doctor summarized, walking her to the door. "I won't keep you any longer. Wait for news from me." There was no news from Mrs. Brown, though it had been several long, drawn-out days. Maria just waited, oblivious to life. Her book had come to a standstill. Household chores piled up at the gym. The woman had neglected even her granddaughter, and she hadn't visited her lately. All this mysterious history of Kevin, his mystery so absorbed the writer that she simply ceased to live normally. Does he really have access to a complete toolkit for growing clones? Why then doesn't he reveal his invention to the world? Why hide it? And of course, the main question is, why would this psychopath want a clone of Maria herself? Poor girl. I mean, she was gravely ill. Apparently, clones can't live very long. It must be against nature. The writer could not find a place for herself, and there was still no news from Mrs. Brown. But one morning, the doorbell rang unexpectedly and even frighteningly. Maria jumped on the spot when she heard it. Her heart rolled frantically. Heaven went dark in her eyes. The woman thought. Almost as soon as he left, she changed the locks. The writer, still shaking in her hands, opened the app on her phone, showing the real-time surveillance camera in the yard. Her heart was relieved. Alex was standing on the doorstep. "Honey, why didn't you warn me?" I was freaking out. My nerves were shot. She opened the door with a gesture inviting the man into the house. "I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking, I was nervous." He kissed her cheek, nervous. "Why did you find something out?" Maria walked her lover into the kitchen and immediately turned on the coffee machine. They sat down opposite each other. Indeed, the journalist was visibly nervous. His gaze was running, and on his forehead protruded from the guy. When the coffee was ready, the man, having previously added as many as 6 cubes of cane new sugar, began his story. "I'm not quite sure if all these oddities have anything to do with each other. But here's what I found out. While digging through the archives, I noticed a strange pattern. From time to time, the local newspapers run news stories that are as similar to each other as 2 peas in a pod. Crowds of teenagers are periodically flown into town by private jet. As a rule, they are homeless. Nobody needs them, even dirty. And their further fate is unknown. One of the journalists conducted an investigation and found out that private plane always came. Such news appeared steadily in our editorial office about once a year, and then everything was lost. And those journalists who wrote about the teenagers either abruptly resigned or just mysteriously disappeared nowhere. Except our archive of this information is not there. It's been carefully removed from everywhere, but the fact remains. That's all I know. Forgive me and farewell, and you may not see me off." And Mrs. Brown left the house quickly. "Gee," said Alex, "what are we going to do now?" Maria did not know what to answer. She had dreamed for so long of finding out as soon as possible what her husband was hiding. But she did not expect such a development. She mechanically ran over in her hands the piece of paper left by Mrs. Brown. On it, the doctor had written the address of that house and the name of the mysterious site. She said tiredly, "I don't know, honey. I think we're at a dead end." Alex was silent for a long time, twirling his empty coffee cup. His eyebrows were furrowed in a frown, and his gaze expressed puzzlement. After long minutes of sepulchral silence, he rose abruptly to his feet and spoke confidently. "That's what she told them, me journalists. 2 months passed." Alex, under the guise of being interested in such a mysterious vacancy journalist, sent his resume to the email address specified on that site. Communication with Maria had to be temporarily stopped. That position was too suspicious, and the man reasonably assumed that before hiring him, he would be organized surveillance. Maria had been out of the loop. Even before Alex had responded to the position, they had bought themselves a regular button on his phone. One of his programmer acquaintances assured him that such communication devices are quite hard to wiretap and somehow track down. And a text message, or even a text message, such a phone is quite capable of sending and receiving. Since the day when the lovers stopped all communication, a whole month has passed. The writer still didn't know if he had been hired for the job. She didn't even know if her lover was alive. She, though with a heavy heart, continued to live, was engaged in her granddaughter, spent a lot of time with her daughters, worked, rested, played sports, sometimes went to master classes in drawing. She seemed to go into a waiting mode. She had no idea what news Alex would return with. The only thing to do was to wait, without giving any sign. But the long wait was eventually rewarded, and Maria, one dark night, received several messages on her secret phone. When she saw what the journalist had written, she was distraught. Her hair stood up and the blood in her veins was cold. Alex wrote the following: Maria, as soon as you read this message, immediately delete it. This place is going to hell. This house is full of clones, but not like we thought. These psychopaths are stealing teenagers from dysfunctional families, alcoholics, drug addicts. They're stealing teenagers who have no one to stand up for them. They bring them to this creepy house. They get plastic surgeries and chips. They get psychologists and psychiatrists. The teenagers are convinced that they are clones of real people. They turn ordinary Russian children into copies of celebrities, whom they do not only. They're in Brad Pitt and Monica Bellucci. They sing the faces and bodies of teenagers, making them exact copies of Hollywood. And not just stars. That's why they need plastic surgeons. They spend their days performing surgeries. The whole life of this hell house revolves around crippled children, so they need cooks, cleaners, doctors, programmers to delete any news about them. Journalists, like me, are obliged to advertise their services covertly. Then these converted celebrity children are sold as slaves to very rich and powerful people. The rich pay unbelievable sums of money to get themselves a star. I saw that kid who was remade as Volant Delon. He's dead, he's covered in holes. His consciousness has already left his body, he's rotting alive. Apparently he escaped from them, and then they caught him. And now Kevin's experimenting on him. These kids don't live long. The body just can't handle that many operations. Can't handle the chips that implanted in the poor kids' brains can't save them. They're real monsters. They've already lost the ability to speak, to think. Everyone here is violent and dangerous. We can't put Kevin and his accomplices in jail. It's all bought. That leaves one option. I've asked a friend of mine to help us find him just in case. Mr. Johnson, reporter for the Evening News. Tell him you're asking for my help. He'll know who we're talking about. A friend of mine knows a whole gang of criminals. They owe him a favor. Take them with you, promise them any money, and order them to destroy this devil's house. It must be wiped off the face of the earth at any cost, even if I die with them. It's the only way to rid the world of this madness. Hurry. Maria's eyes went black. She, trying not to pass out, opened the next message. It was Emma with shaking hands. The writer uploaded what she saw in the picture left a deep mark on her soul for the rest of her life. In the picture was the same Maria clone girl, the one she saw within the walls of the clinic, and her husband. The girl was in a gruesome state of her emaciation. Her body was covered in holes and there was no hair on her head. She had probably had some kind of brain surgery. Maria, not remembering what she saw, deleted all her messages and threw the little foam against the wall. She couldn't believe that her husband had arranged all this. The man she'd lived with for 30 years. All the things Alex had found out just didn't fit in her head. She realized she had to act. At night, the writer still couldn't sleep. She went in search of Alex's friend, Mr. Johnson. Finding the man wasn't difficult. The woman, not knowing at all where it would be more appropriate to start, simply called out the name of her lover. Fortunately, that was more than enough. Mr. Johnson turned out to be a man who could be trusted. Alex had warned him in advance that he was going on a dangerous business trip. He assumed that there might be real bandits in that house, and he was not mistaken. Mr. Johnson, after making a few calls, assured the fictionist that she was safe. Though he could not travel north with Maria, he had a team of stout men assigned to her. Those men did not ask too many questions, and so they, along with Maria, were already sitting in a large truck and driving towards the House of Hell. It was time to finish Kevin once and for all. The truck stopped not far from the mysterious house. The woman, after waiting for one of the bugets to give her a hand, climbed out of the vehicle. They didn't want to be seen, but the house was clearly visible. It was a building rather like a prison. High fence with barbed wire, dirty gray walls. Maria could see the bars on the windows of that gloomy house. What a horror, the writer thought. The same idea kept popping up in her mind. Even a hope. It couldn't be. Kevin is not the cause of all this, the fiction writer thought. There was no way she could bear the thought that her spouse was capable of such a thing. He was truly a brilliant man. His sharp mind envied by many people, all the same not for nothing he was able to achieve such heights. Maria always thought that her husband would be engaged in a useful business, that all his knowledge and skills man will direct to make the world a better place. How wrong was she? She turned around, unable to look at the house anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes. She wanted to have a word with someone, but she felt her voice trembling. She peeked under the lump that had entered. Took a couple deep breaths. It's done. Are you sure you can handle it? Asked the writer in charge. Don't worry, everything will go like clockwork. Smirked one of the guys. Woman you, a man, smiled when Mr. Johnson suggested that she use the services of mercenaries. Maria was beyond outraged. Evil sows more evil, she said. She wondered, is it possible to defeat bandits by enlisting the help of other bandits? She was convinced that evil could only be defeated by good, and at first he was reluctant to help in this strange way. However, Mr. Johnson managed to change her mind. He told the excited women that those mercenaries were not as bad as they might seem at first glance. Yes, they have many questionable, dangerous weapon skills in their arsenal, but they never use them against ordinary civilians. That squad was usually hired to put other thugs in their place. And they, though they looked like criminals, had their own strong moral principles. Hearing about the mad scientist, the head of the group immediately agreed to the case. And when he found out how many lives this madman had ruined, he swore to strangle him personally. Of course, not the least role was played by the sum that was promised to the teen for the elimination of this nightmare. The plan was made quickly, as the house was obviously well guarded. It was decided to blow it up, to infiltrate the territory at night, when most of the house's population was already asleep, and to hang explosives all around the perimeter. Thankfully, the mercenaries had a lot of experience in such an unusual field. Although they were large and pumped up, they could move silently and hide like Japanese ninjas. The sun was setting before the fulfillment of the plan. There were only hours left. Maria was on pins and needles. More than anything, she wished Alex could have been gotten out of the house before the explosion by texting him. She was afraid. Maybe someone had already found his secret phone and taken it away. She couldn't risk it. It was too dangerous. All she could do was wait. The hour of reckoning had arrived. A group of militants, led by their commander, set off on the case, leaving Maria in the car with one of his men. They were dressed in camouflage. They managed to penetrate into the territory of the house, remaining undetected. This is how the events in the house took place unknown to the woman. She tried to distract herself from what was happening, pulled out her small laptop, and her fingers tapped at the keyboard. It's hard to be a clone. That was the title of the woman's new book. She was going to write it on behalf of that poor guy. Yes, she seemed ready to write another masterpiece. At least an hour passed, and the mercenaries returned to the unremarkable truck Maria was sitting in. Well, how did it all come out? With hope in her voice, she asked. You bet everything went smoothly, grinned their leader. The whole house and grounds are littered with explosives. It's like a minefield. It's just a matter of pushing the right button. A cold sweat broke out on the woman's back. The main bandit proudly handed Maria a small but weighty object with wires sticking out of it in all directions and a big red button in the middle. The man continued, "Don't pull the button and those things will end." Maria hesitated. She asked in a quiet, husky voice, "What about Alex? Is there no way to save him?" The bandit hesitated. "Well, we could try. I could sneak right inside the house and find him. But if I'm spotted, you'd still have to blow up the house. But with me. And I'm not going to the afterlife, lady." "Yes, and in such a nasty company, I'll go there myself," Maria said firmly. The man's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you crazy? Don't even think about it." But Maria confidently rose to her feet and got out of the car. "It's all right. Kevin won't hurt me. Probably take your button back if I don't come back. In 20 minutes, push it. Is that enough time?" "Yeah," he nodded. "That's just about the limit." Turning around, she headed towards the dreaded house. She approached the gates closely. The tall white columns looked eerie and intimidating. Maria spotted a small, unpleasant button and confidently pressed it with her thumb. "This is definitely a bell," she thought. A couple minutes later, the gate opened with a nasty smear and the woman walked inside. As she entered the grounds of the creepy place, She quickly texted Alex with the one-word run. What she really wanted was one more look into Kevin's eyes and find out why he had become like this. She went to the high doors of the house. They were opened with a frantic drinking heart. The woman stepped inside. Kevin was already waiting for her there. You do realize it was me who opened the gate for you. How did it come out on me? The man asked stiffly. He stood leaning against some giant box. His eyes burned with true madness. The woman looked around without answering. The first room that could be accessed through the main door was some sort of huge warehouse. There were boxes lying around, some sort of surgical-like instruments scattered about. Maria clapped nervously. I know everything. Why? Tell me, why do you need all this? You're not like that in his heart, shouted the writer. Kevin laughed. Since the last time the couple had met, he had changed a lot. He was no longer like himself. He seemed to have gone completely insane during that time. That's just the way I am. Darling, a great scientist who can change the world. You wouldn't understand. You're too stupid and too old for that. Don't you feel sorry for the souls you've ruined? How many people you've killed? All for what? To make money. Wasn't money enough for you? The woman screamed. She took a step towards her husband, but on second thought, set aside some strange feeling that consumed her, and she began to look for something to defend herself with. A rather large scalpel was lying nearby. Kevin took a couple steps forward, noticeably staggered. He said, this has nothing to do with money. It's an opportunity to clone a human being, an opportunity to escape old age. Look how young all my clones are. Isn't that true happiness? Maria finally realized. It wasn't her husband in front of her. He was a real madman, a crazy, sick man. He wasn't the man she married. This Kevin had simply disappeared. She quietly asked, why did you want my clone? Did you really want to sell it to someone? Poor girl, you destroyed her. Why did you tear down that clinic? Why did you delete the message from my phone? Why did Kevin come closer? Grabbed his wife's hand and started talking in rapid pauses, breathing. Yes, because I love you and always have. It hurts me to watch you grow old, to watch your body accuse and wrinkle. It hurts. I created you again. That young girl I once loved, that was the real you. He looked bitterly at Maria. My people deleted the text. They're the best it guys in the world. The clinic was torn down, of course. What are you, an idiot, that you don't meddle where you're not asked? And the doctor that sent you was along with her nosy man. Now they're screwed too. But that's enough. At last you know everything. Maria turned pale with horror. She said quietly, Kevin, you're getting old too, aren't you? Even if you create your own clone, it won't be you anymore. He laughed loudly again. Of course it won't be me. I'm not stupid. With a few more experiments, I'll be able to transplant my brain into another body. I'll live forever, won't you? He turned around abruptly. Yes, that Maria is already dead. She just recently got brain cancer. She's the reason I opened that clinic. I realized the mistake. The best clone is the closest relative. Our Molly would be perfect for that role. I've got it all figured out. I'll make your clone out of her and transplant my brain into my nephew's body. Maria, we'll live forever. And then the madman saw something he never expected to see. While he was enthusiastically telling about his plans, Mayer pacing the room and waving his arms, his wife discreetly raised a scalpel and stabbed his psychopath right in the stomach. The scientist's mouth filled with blood. He slowly settled to the floor. Burn in hell through Maria. She turned around and left the room, finding herself in a long corridor. There were horrible screams coming from behind different doors. She already thought that all was lost. Suddenly, a frightened, completely gray-haired man came out of the far door. It was Alex. He was beside her and grabbed her hand and shouted, "Run," holding hands. They ran out of the orphanage. They ran without looking back, trying not to think about what would happen next. When they ran out of the gate and ran a couple more meters toward the truck, there was a deafening explosion. Ik Abdallah was insulted by a stream of air. In spite of the heat, Maria turned around. A house full of madmen, full of monsters of real monsters, burning with blue flames. It was impossible to escape from such a fire, as the house was in the middle of nowhere and there was nothing nearby. Maria knew for sure no one would survive, no one would save them. She turned to Alex. It's over. No more broken bodies and fated souls. Hugging each other, they got into the truck. Ahead of them were happy years together. There would be as many of them as they had time for. And no one, not a single person on Earth, has the right to interfere with that order.